Okay, so welcome to the video podcast, Modern Family Law podcast, and today we're going to be talking about how the wheels come off the bus during a divorce. And with me today is Courtland Williams, one of our associates.
Good morning.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
So, Courtland, what you go by Cory? So
Yeah.
I'll use that. So, Cory, what happens when the wheels come off in a divorce?
Well, when the wheels come off in a divorce, usually the parties start arguing more, getting more attorney's fees logged, and just a breakdown in communication is usually what happens. Whether or not they're using attorneys or not, just the infighting usually coming out of some form of spite or a place of being hurt through the whole process.
Okay, and sometimes can it be just one of the parties, one of the lawyers?
It can. It can be one of the parties. I've had instances where one of the lawyers is over litigious, so it can be both. It can be any party or any attorney, but the issue is usually a breakdown in communication and or a feeling coming from a place of being hurt.
When you say a breakdown of communication, tell me what you mean.
Whether or not the parties or the attorneys understand exactly what they're talking about, if they're communicating about the same thing, or whether or not they see something completely different in terms of how they view a certain situation.
So give me an example of where the communication might break down because they're miscommunicating about a certain thing.
With say like spousal maintenance. One party
That's a tough one.
Yes, one party may view another person's income, that a calculation would be more based on what a court would find. However, if that person, say, has their own business and a lot of that money goes back into the business instead of into their pocket, that's not calculated as net income. So they may have a discrepancy over whether or not that is income which they should be getting in terms of spousal maintenance.
So in that case, you're talking about figuring out what the incomes are for the purposes of using the formula to figure out what
Yes.
maintenance is. And that's a legitimate dispute sometimes.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of times trying to figure out whether somebody getting paid for their car is income or whether it's a business expense
Yes.
can be a legitimate dispute that the two of them are just disagreeing on, right?
And when there's a breakdown in communication, those disputes often aren't really resolved in a timely manner.
Okay. So tell me about have you seen it where it's not a reasonable dispute that causes the wheels to come
Yes.
off the bus?
I spent more time trying to get one client a television than the television itself costs.
And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
It made
right?
no sense. And it wasn't here. It was in California. But at that time, the client didn't care. He wanted that television.
So it really wasn't about the television, though.
It wasn't about the television.
The television was a proxy for some other.
Exactly.
Well, what was? I mean, do you see that often?
Not as often as one would think, but it's not just a television. Sometimes it's a certain number of hours to spend with the child, etc. People sometimes lose the trees through the forest. They see what they want in front of them, but they don't understand the whole concept behind it. They want that 1 hour extra with the child when they could settle this whole business with the attorneys and just do what's in the best interest of the children and split time as equitably as possible.
Yeah, oftentimes, I mean, what I see is they choose something to fight over.
Yes.
And that's really not what they're fighting.
And then, no, because like I said in the beginning, some people are coming from a place of hurt. Usually in divorce and child custody, no party is unscathed. And so there is retaliation that occurs, and sometimes it will focus on one situation and try and make that the most important of the case when it may not be.
Right. And so, I mean, in my experience, I've seen people literally fight over the dish towels and the light bulbs.
Yes.
Or the color of the tennis shoes, you know, I mean, but it's really not about that. Like you said, sometimes it's because they're hurt.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they don't want to get divorced, right?
True.
I mean, they just don't
Yeah.
want to cross that finish line because they're
Yeah.
afraid or because they're regretful or something, right?
And usually what I've found is that those individuals, once they actually do cross the finish line, they're much more relieved. I believe the stress of going through a divorce can make people do irrational things.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we see that expressed by them picking a proxy for an
Exactly.
argument. And like you said, sometimes it's whether the kids are dropped off at 4 or 4:30. Goddamn it,
Yeah.
and we're going to fight over that for the next
Yeah.
$100,000.
Which doesn't make sense.
Right. And but recognizing, what do you do? I mean, because we know when they put their foot down about the dish towels,
Mhm.
that this is not really what this is about.
Yes.
How do you deal with that?
I try and convey that to the client in the most respectful way. I know their priorities are important and we need to zealously represent them. However, there comes a time where you need to step in and indicate to the client that you don't want to win a battle and lose the war. Divorce is not always a zero-sum game, and it can be looked at as both parties can win. However, if you're focusing on certain battles, you miss the big picture. The big picture, if there's children, is trying to do the best interest of the children. If it's a divorce with separation of marital assets, you don't want to squabble over candle holders when you have something as large as an IRA as well.
Mhm.
It just doesn't make sense. You want to focus on the big ticket items, get those equitably divided, and then worry about the other things later.
Yeah, I remember I had a case, nowadays these time trials are a big thing, right?
Yes.
They give you an hour to present $1 million
Yeah.
divorce case. And I had one of those against a really, really good lawyer, and it was the permanent orders hearing,
Mhm.
and he got up there and he spent all his time talking about the pots and the pans and the rugs.
Yeah.
And by the time he was done, he hadn't talked about the retirement accounts and the maintenance.
Or any large credit card
Or
debts.
any large
Yeah.
credit. I mean, and I was just flabbergasted when, that somebody would prioritize that. And I think that's a case where, the wheels came off the bus for the lawyer because they didn't focus on what was really important on that case.
Yes.
And so how do you deal with that with a lawyer sometimes who is the obstacle? And it's just like, this case should settle.
Yes.
You know what's going to happen in court, but the lawyer just won't get there.
It depends. It depends on the attorney. It depends on what's been going on before. Usually I try and start off as nice as possible. But at some point you got to send a pretty stern email or letter saying that this should have been settled a long time ago. I had a case where it was under a 2-year marriage and they were squabbling over property, etc. My client wanted to settle, the opposing party wanted to go to court, and we did end up settling. And it only happened after some pretty stern emails and requests for attorney's fees if it went to court happened. It still took a lot more money than it should have, though.
Yeah, that's really tough when you've got a lawyer who's the cog in the wheel of the process. And what I tell my clients is, the great equalizer is the judge.
Exactly.
And that's sometimes the best you can do is just get the case ready for a judge when you can't get through to the other side.
Yes.
Sometimes though, like when the wheels come off the bus, either because of the lawyer or the client, and sometimes though, you have to give up a little bit more just to get it done for the peace of mind of getting it done, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's not always the case, but you becoming entrenched is oftentimes just as bad as the other side being unreasonable.
Yes, you have to pick and choose your battles. Like with the television, it's not worth arguing over. You don't want to become entrenched in one issue and miss the other issues as well. You just got to realize what's important most. And although your client is who you're representing, you need to provide the proper advice and information to them to understand why this is important or why this is not important. And then they can dictate how you want to proceed from there.
Okay. What about any suggestions you have for a client who is up against, we represent a client, for example, who's up against somebody who's pro se, who doesn't have a lawyer, who's on their own, and they're not being rational, they're not being reasonable. They also don't know what's going to happen in court, and they don't know the rules.
Mm-hmm.
How do you counsel a client through that case when you've got somebody on the other side who's just very difficult to deal with?
With that, I try and indicate going to mediation is important. because with the mediator, there's an objective third party, because you're not going to get to court right away. And if it does seem like mediation is not something that's going to work out at all, you can file a motion to try and get mediation waived in order to go to court. But you have to attempt to work with the opposing party first. And if it just doesn't seem reasonable, then that's when you try and get to court.
Yeah, I like the mediation route when you're dealing with somebody who's unrepresented, because they don't trust us, right?
No.
We can't say, look, you have to do this. You got to turn over your sworn financial statement, Or when I say, you're never going to get, $10,000 a month maintenance on a 6-month marriage.
Yeah.
But you go find a really, really good mediator, right?
Yes.
And this unrepresented person can establish a relationship with the mediator, who is, by their nature, not
representing
anybody, and they're unbiased, and yet they can begin to trust the opinions of that person, and that's always a strategy too. But oftentimes it can be hard to get them in there. I don't want to pay that $1,000 a day to go sit with the mediator. Why do we got to sit there all day with the mediator?
Yeah. Because it's cheaper to do that, to settle all the issues, than it is
cheaper
for 4 to 8 hours in court. So
yeah, it's the best money they'll spend on the case.
And plus, with the mediator, it's not in the judge's hands; it's in their own hands. They get to decide the terms of their agreement, if they can agree on anything, and that's probably the best thing about a mediator is the parties get to decide what they want, what's in the best interest for them or their children.
So, of all the cases you handled, how many times, what percent do you see the case, at least temporarily, at least for a little bit, the wheels come off the bus in the case and somebody's being irrational, unreasonable?
It depends on the type of case. Probably less than 10% where someone's being unreasonable. The last case I had was one of those. But it was just based off an emergency motion, so it wasn't a full-on divorce or anything like that. Usually in the long divorces and the allocation of parental responsibilities, the parties are trying to be somewhat reasonable, and attorneys do help with that reasonableness, because the attorney can advise the client, you are being unreasonable at this time. Let's try and make these requests reasonable.
Okay, well, I also want to let you know that I got an email from an opposing counsel on a case you just finished, and you said you did an excellent job.
Awesome.
So,
great.
But any other last thoughts before we call it a day?
No, just try and remain reasonable if you're a client, and if you're an attorney, try and keep level-headed and let the client know what can and should happen.
All right. Sounds like good advice.